What's up, guys? It's Ben with 2020 election predictions. And in today's video, I'm going to model the hypothetical scenario that there is 100% turnout among registered voters, which obviously is not going to happen. But I've seen in my comments and in a lot of articles, turnout in the 2020 election is going to be key. And traditionally and instinctively, I think for a lot of people, we hear that if turnout is up, this helps the Democrats. But I'll show you in this video that is not necessarily the case. Trump has just completely changed politics. He's changed the electoral map. And actually, if turnout is increased in some specific states, it actually could go to Donald Trump's advantage. And I'll show you that in just a little bit. But this is a model that I've showed y'all before, and I predicted the 2020 election using demographics. So this was earlier in my channel in March, and I'll put the link to that video in the description. But essentially, what we have right here is we started with the results of the 2012 election and the support for each party's candidates by the five demographic groups. And I don't necessarily buy into that these are the five key demographic groups. I think this is what we see in the media a lot, just kind of they like to slice and dice the American electorate in terms of race. And then because white is the biggest racial demographic group, they like to divide it between non-college educated whites and college educated whites, which I don't love dividing people by race, just because I think that people of the same race and different races can think alike and different. But this is what we see a lot in the media, and I do think this is a helpful model for kind of understanding some basic political premises. So this was the electoral distribution of the 2012 race between Mitt Romney and President Obama. As you can see, like North Carolina, Mitt Romney won this in 2012, but he lost states like Ohio and Iowa. So let's just go here. So we have 6% R. Let's take this demographic thing up by 100%. And let's do it for every single, I believe that was 54, and see who this helps. So we see when I did the 100% for the whites, it actually moves the race towards Mitt Romney, which makes sense. But then when I did black turnout at 100%, it helped President Obama. But this is also using the 2012 results, which obviously are very different. So actually, if we do 100% turnout for all demographic groups, it doesn't change much in the 2012 race. We see a little bit of shift towards the popular vote towards President Obama, or see, this is in terms of President Obama and Trump. But now that we have the results for the 2012 election, and I've done this before briefly, I'm going to change these lean R and lean Democrat groups to see what actually happened in 2016, so we can see what would happen if the turnout was 100% in the 2016 election. So if we look among black voters, 89% of them supported Clinton, 8% Trump, and 3% other or no answers. So I'm going to give two of these to Clinton and one of these to Trump, just for the sake of this model. So that's 91% for Clinton, which is actually a little bit less. So 91. And then let's see for Hispanic voters, Latinos, so 66. Let's divide these up 4 and 2. So that's 70%. 70, go -1. Also, the third party here is about what, 4%, 5%. And then among Asians, it's like 70 or so. Asian is the smallest voting demographic group in the United States. Now let's get to the interesting part. Non-college educated whites and college educated whites take up the biggest segment of, if we look at the racial demographics of the race, and I'll show you that later. So white college graduates, 48%, 45. So let's just split this evenly. Let's add 4 to Trump's 48. So actually less support. So, okay, 52 right here. Now this is where it's going to get interesting. So 66, 5%. Let's add 3 to this, just because the other no answer are people who just don't answer. And I'm just going to assume that they're like the general population. So that's 3%. That's 69, which is a lot. And this is going to shift the race dramatically. So what we see here, that if turnout was 100% in the 2016 election and all the people who didn't vote voted according to their racial groups overall on average, we see that Trump actually would have won the electoral college by a greater margin than he did in 2016, and he would win the popular vote. And this is, I would say, probably against the conventional wisdom that when we see increases in voter turnout, that the Democrat normally wins. And I do think that this is true overall on average. We saw in 2008 and 2012 that voter turnout was higher. And this definitely helped President Obama, kind of his younger, more diverse coalition. They call it the Obama coalition. And also, one thing that we hear in the media and from Democrats a lot is that voter ID laws and for example, felon disenfranchisement is an attempt to suppress the vote. So we hear a lot that Republicans want to suppress the vote because lower turnout helps Republicans overall. And I do agree that lower turnout does help Republicans on average more than Democrats. I don't want to have an opinion on voter ID laws or anything like that. And also, one fact that I've actually read on articles across the board is that college Republicans actually typically do not hold as many voter registration drives at colleges because, on average, the college population is so overwhelmingly Democratic that they would probably register more Democrats than Republicans. So I think this kind of contributes to the narrative. Obviously, the college demographic is heavily more Democratic than the nation overall. But obviously, this is not what the results, the 2016 results are not going to mimic the 2020 results also. And then one thing that is at fault in this model is this is assuming 2012 demographics on the nation overall. And just so if we look right here, if we look right here, so this was the overall electorate in 2012, and this is the projected electorate in 2020. And even over this 20 year span, it has changed a lot. The white population has decreased by 10%, and we see the biggest percentage gain in the Hispanic vote. The Black vote has actually remained pretty stagnant, and the Asian vote has seen a slight increase. But because the Asian demographic is the smallest, and also it's if we can just see from the polls coming out, they are the kind of the most even demographic group in terms of who they support, Republicans or Democrats. So this model, it will not be perfect to guess the 2020 election because this is weighted at 2012, what the electorate and what the demographics were in 2012. And also, I think that Biden is going to make gains in certain these categories, and also voter turnout is not going to be 100%. So I want to go over this article that I think was pretty interesting in 538. And basically the title is "Increased Voter Turnout Could Benefit Republicans or Democrats." And I just want to go through a few things. So that basically the Knight Foundation poll did this survey of 12,000 people who don't vote ever. And typically political scientists don't focus on these people at all because they're not relevant. They aren't going to help them. But what they found is that non-voters are less white, less educated, poorer, younger, and more likely to be women than those who don't vote. And based on the stereotypical voter from these demographics, you would think that these would be a large pool of potential Democratic voters because they tend to be younger and more diverse. But if we look at the 6 battleground states that matter, and truly only 6 states are going to matter probably in the 2020 election because of the electoral college, what it says is that President Trump if everyone votes, that he could actually have a advantage over the chronic non-voters. So this is the model that I think is very, very interesting. So the voter preferences of people who don't normally vote, and which really is not relevant. We see that in Alabama, which makes sense. It's a pretty conservative state. There's probably people who just don't vote in the election because they know their vote doesn't matter. But if we look in the key swing states, Pennsylvania, President Trump got 36% and the Democrat nominee got 28%. This polls probably are not going to matter as much, but if Trump can get, I mean, I think every year there's about 100 million people who are eligible to vote, but just simply do not. If Trump can get 36 million of those, or like, I mean, even if in Pennsylvania there's 400,000 people who don't vote, and he gets like 40% of those, I mean, that can turn the election over. I do think that a lot of Black voters are going to be inspired to turn out to vote in the 2020 election. If we look at this figure, we see that in the 2016 election, the main group that had a decline from the last presidential election, which was 2012, was Black Americans. So Black Americans actually voted at a higher rate than white Americans in the 2012 election, but we see this 5 to 6 point gap in 2016. I do think that this will be a lot more even in the 2020 election, especially with like the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests. So I definitely think that that will help Biden going forward, and that Biden will definitely pick up a lot of these voters, like especially in a state like Georgia and Michigan that have higher Black populations than the nation overall. But one thing that I think is pretty interesting from the Knight Foundation survey is that it's possible that a lot of these chronic non-voters do vote in 2020. In 2016, Trump inspired a lot of people who don't normally vote in the Rust Belt to vote in 2016, and this really changed the election. And that's the reason why the polls were so off, is because these pollsters didn't include these people that typically don't vote in their polling algorithm. But what the Knight Foundation found is that 55% of these voters say with absolute certainty they are going to vote this year. I definitely think this number is inflated in terms of who is actually going to turn out to vote, because I mean, words are a lot different than actions. But I do believe that especially with the younger generation, that there is kind of this motivation and I think more inspiration to go vote. It's just in our pop culture all the time, and with social media, I do think people who don't really care about politics are going to turn out to vote. And instinctively, this would help Biden. And I mean, Biden is up in the polls a lot right now, and I trust those polls to a degree. But I think especially in these Rust Belt states where there are large white working class population, these people aren't necessarily college educated. I do think there's people that stayed home to vote in 2016 that will come out and vote in 2020 because they realized that President Trump could win. Maybe these people stayed home because they didn't think President Trump would win in 2016, and that they're more inspired to vote in 2020 because it's become more of a cultural phenomena. But I will be really interested to see the demographics and how they turn out. This graph right here should honestly scare Republicans in the future, because a lot of their base voters are white. They definitely need to make gains in the Hispanic, Black, and Asian populations, because if this trend continues downwards, then simply they cannot win elections with these percentage of voters. I mean, they're ahead with non-college educated whites and barely with college educated whites here. I honestly think this could flip in the 2020 election, but they really have to make gains, substantial gains in the Hispanic, Asian, and Black voters. And in future videos, I'm going to focus on different demographic groups in more detail and do specific videos on those, and kind of focus more on like what the polling numbers are and like what each candidate has to do to like win the election with a certain demographic group. So I really hope you liked this video, and be on the lookout for a video tomorrow. Thanks, guys, and please subscribe here if you haven't already.